Hello, my name is Dr. Amy Thompson, and I'm at the University of Texas at Austin. My talk is titled Historic and Spatial Narratives of Indigenous Landscapes, Mopan and Q'eqchi Maya Land Tenure and Village Formation in Southern Belize. I would like to thank the Heritage Education Network Belize team for hosting the second annual Cultural Symposium. My presentation today is looking at the historic narratives of communities, Maya communities in Southern Belize, asking the question of how does ecology and sociopolitical formation influence settlement selection in the region? I do this through a lens of historical ecology, which looks at the dynamic relationships between humans and the environment, including both how humans change the environment and how the environment impacts human adaptations. To do this, I'm looking at narratives from historic contexts, and I do this through an extensive literature review to collect data on the different communities, how they changed and developed over time, including the foundation of them, and things like why people may have fissioned off and formed new communities. And I do this for about 50 Mopan and Q'eqchi Maya villages in southern Belize. The Maya region is divided into three large geographic regions: the northern lowlands, the southern lowlands, and the highlands. And Belize, and indeed southern Belize as well, are located primarily in the southern lowlands, with southern Belize consisting of the Toledo district and Stan Creek district, which is the focus of my talk today. This map shows the distribution of both modern and ancient Maya cities in southern Belize, where modern villages are indicated by the gray circles and ancient communities are indicated by the black triangles. And we can see that there are several different geographic regions, including the Maya Mountains to the north, the foothills, the coastal plains, and finally the coastal areas and keys in the sea. And there are distinct and diverse resources available in each of these four main ecological zones: the keys and coasts, the coastal plains, the foothills, and the Maya Mountains. We can see that in the past, during the ancient Maya time periods from about 250 to 850 CE, that Maya communities were dispersed across all four of these major regions, including Maya communities located on the Keys and the coastal plains, the foothills, and up in the Maya Mountains. Today, that is more restricted to the foothills and coastal plains area, where we have communities along the kind of edge of the foothills and into the foothills and residing along the coastal plains, but no modern communities are located in the Maya Mountains. We can also then look at the distribution of language groups in Maya communities in southern Belize, and specifically looking at Mopan and Q'eqchi villages in the region. We can see by the green dots, these are where Mopan villages are located, and the blue dots indicate which villages the primary language is Q'eqchi, and yellow indicators show villages that speak both Mopan and Q'eqchi. We also have villages that speak other languages, or other languages as their primary form of communication, including Garifuna communities like Barranco and East Indian communities like Hasitanville and Forest Home in southern Belize. This talk is primarily focusing on the Mopan and Q'eqchi villages in the Toledo district. So a quick history of southern Belize, as this informs these historic and social narratives of how people moved onto the landscape and then formed different and new villages. So we know that the classic Maya communities were there in the classic period from about 250 to 800, 900 CE, but we also know that there were ephemeral post-classic Maya communities in southern Belize. This is documented through different contexts from about 1000 to the 1520s. There were likely Manche Chol and Mopan Maya communities residing in the southern Belize area. This is a map that is adapted from SAPR 1985 that shows the distribution of different communities that they documented that dated to about the 1500s. So we can see a variety of different communities down in the southern Belize region into the southeastern Petén, around Lake Isabel, and along the coast of the Gulf of Honduras. So we know that the area was not abandoned and it wasn't a vacant landscape, but that you did have a variety of different Maya communities residing in this region during this time period, during the post-classic and then early kind of historic and colonial time periods. In the 1680s and 1689, the Spanish moved through the area and conducted what was later referred to as the reproducciones, which is basically where they gathered up existing Maya communities, forced them to move into larger communities, and tried to convert them into Catholicism. However, we know that in the early 1700s, some Mopan Maya escaped from these different Spanish towns and moved back into southern Belize, and they established what became known as a kilo, sort of these small hamlets consisting of family groups of maybe 3 to 5 different families that were dispersed across the landscape and have a very ephemeral archaeological record. Logging had been occurring in northern parts of Belize for many years, but we don't see logging move into southern Belize until the early 1800s, when the British loggers began exploiting lands in southern Belize as they moved their logging industries further and further south. Part of the reason is that the rivers in southern Belize are a little bit more difficult to navigate than other rivers in Belize, such as the Rio Hondo and the Belize River. But we do start seeing the exploitation of the different lands in southern Belize by British loggers in the early 1800s. And in 1837, private and crown lands were established, and this meant then that occupants on these different crown lands were forced to pay taxes. This is important because folks living in these small kilos likely didn't have a lot of access to money. They weren't moving into these large economic hubs or having access to that, but now they had to start paying taxes on the land that they were living on. In the 1850s, we see larger scale logging companies moving into southern Belize, and we see concessions given to these companies for logging, the continued exploitation of the forest resources. During this time period, too, we also see the establishment of Punta Gorda as a regional economic hub, likely in conjunction with these logging companies. And importantly, in the mid-1880s, we see tensions between the British and the Q'eqchi Maya in northern Belize associated with these different land rights. And then the effects of this trickle down into southern Belize as well, specifically with the establishment of reservations. So due to these tensions between the British government and Q'eqchi Maya in northern Belize, different reservations were established in northern Belize, and those were also established later in southern Belize with increased growing Maya communities in the Toledo district. In the 1880s, we see Qeqchi communities brought in from the Alta Verapaz of the Guatemalan highlands, and they were brought into southern Belize and forced to work as low-wage laborers. And right around that same time period in 1886, it's well documented that a Mopan community fled from oppressive Guatemalan governments, and they fled into southern Belize, and specifically the site of the modern community of Pueblo Viejo in the 1886, and those communities later moved inland further to San Antonio Village in 1889 due to increased tensions with Guatemalan communities. So they moved inland to reduce tensions with other communities. Around that same time period in the 1880s, the Qeqchi village of San Pedro Sarstún was founded. I note that between the 1880s and 1960s, there were major inland transportation routes, but these were primarily just footpaths and navigable rivers. That there were no major roads in the region at the time, and that southern Belize in general was only accessible via boat going from Belize City or other communities further north down into Punta Gorda, and then having to move inland from there via rivers or via footpaths. But in the 1930s, there was the first logging road that was constructed going from Punta Gorda to Dump, so it moved from the coast inland, which provided some access of these inland communities to the economic hub of PG, or Punta Gorda. In the 1970s, the Southern Highway was finally constructed, and this connected the Toledo district to the rest of the country. This is important because it allows different job opportunities and economic opportunities for the communities in the Toledo district. Throughout the late 90s, we see the continued improvement of things like roads, water towers were established, households had access to water via pipes instead of being solely reliant on freshwater springs and rivers. And we see the pavement of important roads, including the Southern Highway going from Stan Creek District south. And we see the pavement of the San Antonio to Halacte Road going from about the dump area of the Southern Highway inland to the border with Guatemala. So we see major changes happen specifically after the 1970s, which increased the integration of the Toledo district into the rest of the Belizean economy. So using this historic narrative, I divided the history of southern Belize into 3 specific time bins in order to assess how did different ecological and social variables influence the settlement selection and establishment of these new communities. And these time bins are from about the 1850s to 1930s when we see the first logging road appear, from 1931 to 1970, 1970 being the important foundation of the southern Belize highway being connected, and then from 1971 to present, which has the increased integration of southern Belize into the Belizean economy. We can then map these kind of trends out into this map where we see again where different Mopan and Q'eqchi Maya communities are located. We can also see the different land holdings that existed in the Toledo district, including reserve and preserve areas in green and private estates or land holdings that are not available for people to move on to in pink, as well as the different reservations for Mopan and Q'eqchi communities in yellow and orange. So this shows us that there's not a lot of land that people can continue to fission off and move into in the districts itself. That a lot of the space is actually held up through either reservations, private estates, or preserve areas. We can then also see the movement of road systems, including the Southern Highway here, and different smaller unimproved roads that connect these villages inland into the major roads. And we see that this road here from Punta Gorda to about Dump was established in 1930, and then the Southern Highway from Dump northward was constructed in the 1970s. And again, we see that Mopan communities were living in the foothill regions from the 1880s to present, and that the Qeqchi communities were living in the southern part of the Toledo district from, again, the 1880s present. So we see these distinct areas where Mopan and Qeqchi communities were residing, but after the 1970s, with the establishment of the Southern Highway, we see them continuing to fission off and move northward, having these less geospatially discrete areas for the different communities. We also see this kind of increased diversity in these communities during that time. So to assess this, I wanted to look at different statistical tests to look at if village foundation date was influenced by things like the type of soil suites, the types of bedrock, the slope of the area, or perceived agricultural value of these lands. So I did statistical tests including a chi-square with a Fisher's exact correction for small sample sizes, as well as a Kruskal-Wallis test with a Wilcox correction for small sample sizes. The ecological data derives from 2 major data sets, which is King et al. 1986 and Wright et al. 1959. Through these chi-square tests and Kruskal-Wallis tests, basically I saw that there was no relationship between the foundation time of villages and the different environmental variables. So things like soil suites or soil types was not influential on where people chose to live. The potential agricultural value of the land is established by King 1986 to influence where people chose to live. Erosion value, land systems, or land regions, including foothills versus coastal plains, weren't impacted by or weren't influential on when people chose to live in those areas. However, the bedrock does seem to have some type of statistical relationship where we see that in earlier time periods, there is more favor towards carbonate and clastic and mixed bedrock types versus in later time periods, including time bin 2 and time bin 3, we see an increased establishment of communities on more alluvium soils or alluvium underlying bedrock areas. So this is statistically significant with a p-value of 0.019. So in general, it looks like these ecological variables weren't super influential in terms of where people were choosing to establish new communities, but likely it was different social variables that we can track and discuss through these historic narratives. So looking at the community fissioning of these Maya communities through time, where the darker colored green and blue dots indicate the oldest Mopan and Q'eqchi communities, and the lighter colored green and blue dots indicate the newest ones based on those time bins I mentioned, we can see how communities in southern Belize were fissioning off and forming new communities through time. Through the historic narratives, we see that there are a few main reasons for village fissioning. One of them being access to land or to be closer to land. Having to walk more than 2 hours to get to your milpa or to your farm meant that people might start establishing new small communities or kilos closer to the farmlands, and eventually these developed into new communities. So an example of that might be San Jose establishing from, or Nalumka establishing from San Jose, for example, there. We also see an increased desire to have access to public services, things like access to roadways, access to buses in order to get to places like Belmopan or Punta Gorda, and access to these different amenities that you get living closer to the road, including things like electricity. And we notice that the cycles of fissioning happen in about generational cycles or about every 20 years, but there's not a set population trend. These villages aren't reaching a carrying capacity of a certain threshold of populations before they fission off. So it seems like it's more to do with different access to public services and amenities rather than hitting an ecological carrying capacity. So in general, we notice that things like access to transportation is important to Maya communities. That seems this case today, historically, and it's also been documented among the classic Maya of southern Belize. But we also note that there are restrictions on where people could live based on these different land holdings, things like preserve areas, private estates, and village reservations or different reservation systems. And it seems that there are shifts in what make a patch of land desirable. This coincides with changing economies and globalization, the establishment of new infrastructure, including electricity and roads, that impacts where people want to live and how that's changed through time from the 1880s to present. So the main conclusions are, it looks like the early Mopan freely occupied highly productive agricultural lands in the Toledo uplands and that foothills region, while the early Qeqchi were brought into southern Belize under a despotic system for these as low-wage laborers. And later sociopolitical regulations kind of constrained where these Maya settlements choices could occur based on economic and political actors who had disproportionate control over access to certain resources. So things like logging concessions. The Maya were allowed to settle on lands, but only those that were available within limited lands, as I showed on the map that showed the distribution of reservations, private estates, and preserves. And that infrastructure, things like roads, water systems, increased and may have increased the suitability of these otherwise agriculturally marginal lands, especially moving up north into along the Southern Highway, and that we see a change in what is desired as what is deemed as suitable or desired land for people to live on. And overall, there seems to be a shift away from farming and greater emphasis on different types of economies. So with that, I thank you, and I'd like to just show some acknowledgements here, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you all so much, and enjoy the rest of the Culture Symposium.